Greetings, composers and arrangers. Welcome to your first talk all about setting up the score. You'll find that there are some elements here that are rather basic, but there might be some things that you'll be surprised that you didn't know. So let's see if we can fill in some of those gaps. Notes on the use of this book. It's intended for professionals like yourselves or college students. It's arranged from general to specific, so let's call this our general day. It uses two specific words that sometimes come up in different contexts. Some people say the woodwind family, for instance. This textbook, you'll notice that Alfred Blatter tends to use choir for, let's say, the woodwind choir, the brass choir, and the string choir. Within each of those choirs, which you might envision as having SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, high, middle, and low, which within each of those choirs, you could envision different families. So for instance, the flute family. Can you think of the three flutes that are common to the orchestra? You're probably picturing the C flute, which is about this range. What about the little baby flute, the small flute, the kleine Flute? Well, of course, that's an octave higher. It covers the extreme range. What about the lower flute? The alto flute. Okay, so you can see within just the flute family, you could think of them as, well, if you need some sort of metaphor, let's say the father, mother, and baby flute. They're part of the same family. But let's say the whole family is part of the choir. Okay, so there you have it. One thing that's very special to this book that I find very useful, and it's something that if you come away from this class knowing the dynamic curves of each instrument, you would do very well for yourself as a composer and arranger. What is this graph telling you? Well, it's saying that this instrument has a range from F on the bass, below the bass staff, to D on the top of the treble staff. And as you go up the scale, it naturally becomes louder. Now, of course, this is the opposite of the piano. If you sit at the piano and play with the same force, you'll notice that the piano, it becomes naturally softer as you ascend. When you descend, it's more easily played forte in the lower range. And this has to do with just the natural property of the piano. Well, of course, every instrument is different, and the dynamic curve will be different accordingly. Another useful thing about this book is that within that dynamic curve, you'll see different ranges. So in this imaginary instrument here, it's saying, well, the professional range is from this G to this D, which is rather large, and it's saying, well, some players are able to push that even lower. Maybe there's an extension on this instrument, or an extra key on some instruments that would extend the range down, and there might be some who could extend the range even higher depending on the technique. Okay, and as you can see, it also includes the high school range, which is going to be slightly more conservative, and the elementary range. Okay, in this imaginary instrument. So it has this layout for every instrument. Very useful. Description is important, listening is vital. Okay, so we will be talking a lot about describing the sounds of various instruments in different contexts, and we will be listening in class, and of course you can extend that to outside of class if you know, anything that you're listening to in your other studies, or for your own pleasure, you might start thinking about, well, what is the property of that instrument? What range We're talking about how does it sound to you, and how does the composer achieve that effect? You might take note of things that you like and come back to them. Why do we have a score? Think about it. Do we always need a score? Well, life would be a lot more complicated, I think, without it. It serves for the composer to have a workbench. Imagine trying to compose an orchestral piece with one part at a time, but not using a score. That would be very difficult. Or let's say you are hired to orchestrate a piece. Maybe your job is to take a piano piece and to arrange it or orchestrate it for a certain ensemble. Well, this is your workbench. This is how you're going about it. This is how the conductor communicates to the orchestra, the ensemble. It's how they understand the work. And the performer's individual instruction. So of course, let's say you have a string quartet. Now it's interesting, not all string quartets will come with a score. It's too bad if they don't, because it is rather useful because you can study the other parts. It's something that it really should come with every edition, but every now and then you see just the parts alone. Well, it's useful for the individual string players. Let's say the first violinist is playing something, but they're wondering, measure 4. What happens in measure 4? There's a rest for me. What is going on in that measure? So that's something that they can reference. Okay, this is a big one. Instrumental order. I would like for you at the end of this course to come away with a general knowledge of basic instrument order. So take a moment. You could jot this down or pause the video as you go. What is the instrumental order of the brass quintet? You can see on the page there's a picture of a brass quintet. Okay, what do you think? Let's see how you did. Trumpet 1, trumpet 2, horn and F, trombone, tuba. Notice I'm using all of the abbreviations, which you should also know by the end of this class very well. Okay, so you could say, in general, this is going from high to low on the page. Trumpet 1, 2, horn, trombone, tuba. Woodwind quintet. Here's a nice picture of a woodwind quintet, just in case you're wondering, wait a moment, what instruments are in the woodwind quintet? So take a few seconds, jot it down or say it to yourself. You can pause the video. And let's see how you did. Flute, oboe, clarinet, horn, bassoon. How did you do? Often when I go around the class asking students, they often switch the clarinet with the oboe. I think we just tend to think of the clarinet as associated with the flute sometimes. So maybe it's just the next instrument that comes to mind. But as we'll study, if you don't know already, the ranges of the flute, the ranges of the oboe, the range of the clarinet, it's extending a little bit lower with each instrument. So the oboe is slightly lower than the flute. The clarinet has a lower range than the oboe in terms of its lowest note possible. You'll notice the horn and the bassoon. Well, that's also in terms of range. Every now and then you'll find a score with the horn on the bottom. It's just because there's not one convention, but it tends to be these days that, well, we tend to think of the bassoon as the bass role in the ensemble, although the horn can certainly play bass notes as well. So you do find some variation there. Okay, here's a hard one. I'm going to give you a few more seconds for this one. Orchestra. Think of the general layout of the orchestra. You have strings. Right, there's the percussion. You have brass. What about woodwinds? Right, what if you have a piano? Where does that go? Or what if you have the choir? Where does that go? Why don't you pause the video for, let's say, 10 to 20 seconds. Try to name as many instruments as you can and see how you do. Okay, so if you thought that the orchestra layout starts with the woodwinds, you are correct. Well done. Okay, so again, starting with from high to low, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon. So essentially that's the same order as the woodwind quintet, subtracting the horn. Okay, the next instrument, the next choir is the brass choir. Now this is interesting. Horn, trumpet, trombone, tuba. What do you notice there? I know what you're thinking. Why is the horn above the trumpet? Well, this has to do with the history of the orchestra. What were the first brass instruments in orchestra? The horn. You could also think of it as connecting the two groups, connecting the two choirs. So the horn, I tend to think of as the glue of the orchestra. It blends well, it really blends well with every instrument. So think of it as blending between the woodwind choir and the brass choir. That's a good way to remember it. Otherwise, the same could be said that trumpet, trombone, tuba, those are also in terms of range, high to low. Okay, what is the next choir? That's right. Okay, so the percussion choir. Notice that the timpani is just after the brass choir. Well, that's not a mistake either, because there's an association, the timpani with the brass. In fact, if you think of, let's say, these sort of figures where the brass, the horns would be playing, bum, 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 bum. Well, with that, you'd have the timpani. Bum, 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 bum. They'd often be played in conjunction. So that's no mistake. And the percussion that was added along the way, you could think of suspended cymbal, crash cymbal, bass drum. We'll talk more specifically about individual instruments later. But wait, we're missing something important. I know you're thinking of the strings, right? Well, actually, this is where the other instrument choir comes in. Let's say, what else would go into an orchestra piece? Well, you could think of a piano, or maybe more commonly, another string instrument, a harp, maybe even two harps, celesta, all sorts of other instruments. Or how about a soloist? What if you have a violin concerto? This is where that violin part would go. Okay, so this is good to know where that other category comes in. And finally, yes, you're right, we have the strings. Okay, and of course, we're going from high to low, violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, double bass. You might just pause the video and write that out for yourself. See if you can remember, without looking at the screen, what we just went over. You could start by listing the choirs first, and then try to fill in as much as you can. I'm willing to bet that you could probably get close to 100% right now, and it would be a good time to review. Okay, so go ahead and do that if you're so inclined. Okay, what about concert band? Well, concert band is similar to orchestra, but you'll notice that it has some peculiarities, slightly different in terms of order. Of course, in concert bands, you're missing what choir compared to the orchestra? Well, I'll give you a hint. Concert band, the other name for it is sometimes called wind ensemble. Right, you're missing the strings. So we start with the woodwinds, flute, oboe, bassoon, clarinet, saxophone. Then we have the brass, cornets, trumpet, horn, trombone, euphonium, tuba, percussion, and I didn't list it there, but sometimes you also have the double bass, which will double with the tuba. Now, what's curious about the concert band? Well, you'll notice flute, oboe, bassoon. Now, this is interesting. The clarinets come after the bassoon. Think of the clarinets and saxophones as being related, because they are. And think of the sax as kind of being a, the halfway point in between the woodwinds and the brass. And you'll have a good way to remember the order. Okay, but as you can see, in general, just like the orchestra, the concert band is laid out from high to low. Jazz band, of course, we won't study too much in the way of jazz band charts in this course, but it's also good to know because you could be in charge of one day. It has the saxes, soprano, alto, tenor, bari. The trumpets, you might have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 parts. Trombones, again, 1, 2, 3, maybe bass trombone. And then we get into the rhythm section, guitar, bass, drums, and lastly, piano. So that's interesting about the jazz band, that the piano is at the very bottom. Okay, so this is a good moment, again, to take a pause, see how much you can remember. Of course, you can always look this information up, but it's good to have a shorthand. Let's say you're in front of a class one day and talking about a score. It's good to remember where things are. Okay, setting up your title and inside pages. Cover title, the cover page, also called the title page. What is on the title page? Can you think of some basic elements? Well, of course, we'd have the composer, the composition, orchestrator, arranger, if it so applies, lyricist, instruments. Notice you have some publishing information at the bottom. The inside cover, this is where you can list things like explanations, instructions to the ensemble. Maybe you have a program note, a paragraph that's all about the composition, how it came to be, why you dedicated it to so-and-so. This is a good place to put any kind of writing. Let's say you use some sort of symbol. You mark it with X's or circles. This is a place to define those sort of things. Okay. And you'll notice in the case of, let's say, an orchestra piece, this would be the place to list your ensemble. First page of music. And this is important. It's something that you might never think of, but go to a published piece of music. You might pull one off your shelf right now. I'm willing to bet if you turn to the first page of music, if it's truly a single piece of music, there will probably not be a page number. Of course, that might not apply if you have a collection. But also notice where it tends to be. So the first page will be on the right side as opposed to the left side. That's going to be your odd number. So that would be page 1. You turn the page and the left side will be even. Again, these are things that, oh yeah, well, of course it's that way, and you might not have just ever thought about it before. Here we have one of my favorite pieces as a youth, and Beethoven's. This is from his Book of Bagatelles. Okay, and there you have all the basics. You have your title, composer, and we're just about to get into that. So where does the title go? Take a moment to think about it. On your page 1, where does the title go? Of course, it's centered right at the top. Your suite from L'Histoire du Soldat, clarinet, violin, piano. Okay, very good. Where does the composer go? Ah, yes, I know what you're thinking. It's on the top right. And here it has his birth year. I'm sorry, that's actually that's interesting. It should be written his birth years, but it's actually his, the date of composition, 1918. Okay. What's interesting about this piece, it was originally written for a septet during World War I, and of course, musicians were hard to come by, so it was actually premiered as a trio first, and then performed as a septet later. What about a lyricist? Okay, well, there are no lyrics in L'Histoire du Soldat, so we're probably talking about a different piece. But can you picture maybe you've played a song, out of a songbook or a soundtrack or something like that? Where does the lyricist go? Ah, yes, on the left. Here we have the Ewok celebration. Okay, and just under, sorry for this, it's a little bit hard to read, but it says freedom, we got freedom. And notice where the lyrics are. We'll talk about the placement of lyrics and some general good practices of setting words to music. But notice on the top left, that's where you'll find the Ewok lyrics by Ben Burt and the English lyrics by Joseph Williams. Interesting, I didn't know that. Okay, what about clefs, key signatures, meters? Here we have Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. This is the second movement. Okay, where did of course, we have the clefs on the left. Key signatures follow, then the meter. Take a moment to think about this. Did you know that the order of events is clef, key signature, meter? You might have been switching meter with key signature, which is a common mistake. And of course, you would only see that meter or key signature at the start of a piece, unless of course it changes. So you're not going to see that 3/4 on the second page. Again, it's something that you've been seeing all your life. You just might not have noticed it. On a first page, let's say of a orchestral piece like this, you'll notice that the systems are indented, and that's to make room for this Floten here, oboen here, clarinetten here. So we need some extra room to identify what the instruments are. Also notice that the choirs are connected with brackets, so you have a large bracket, and then here we have the flutes, which are separated with a brace. So showing the flute family, you have two flutes there, but that's still under the umbrella of the woodwind choir. Okay, and this is another important thing. A lot of people think, oh, well, I'll just save space by, I'm not going to show all the instruments on the first page. Well, actually, this is where you should represent everything. In fact, in general, for an orchestral piece, it's customary not to simplify, as in, even if you have a rest for a lot of instruments, it's typical to see all of the instruments on every page. And that's really especially for the conductor who's used to seeing all of the instruments. Of course, there are exceptions. Let's say if you have a long cadenza for a piano solo or something to that effect, then you might simplify by certain pages. Copyright notice. Do we need copyrights, and where do they go? Well, after 1989, they are optional, but I certainly always put them just as a matter of principle. You want to scare people a little bit, remind them that you're a professional composer. They shouldn't be ripping you off. They need to pay rights if they quote your music, etc. And of course, you've probably seen this symbol many times. You can use just the C. So for instance, C circle 1989 or 1990, or probably more likely 2021 at this point. Or you can write the word copyright, or both. What about the next pages? After page 1, systems are not indented, and you would use abbreviations. So do you know the abbreviation of flute, for instance? Ah, yes, you're thinking FL, period. What about violin? VLN, period. What about trombone? TBN, period. A lot of these abbreviations you will get used to, and it's also possible that some scores don't have abbreviations. For instance, let's say you have a string quartet. Well, you might see the instruments listed on the first page and then not again because it's assumed you know the order. Everything will repeat. The organization of systems and brackets, braces, blank staves, everything repeats. Again, clefs and key signatures are repeated, time signatures are not, as we've said. Okay, so here's some other basics of writing. So, and this is really more for handwritten scores, but it's typical that if there is a space to skip a staff between choirs and handwriting, this is just visually to separate the staves. But again, this is more for handwritten. When impractical, to have separate parts. Okay, so this is important. This is probably something you haven't had time with. I would write this down. So let's say you had 3, let's say, trumpets on one line. And for the most part, they all double. Let's say they mostly play the same note. Sometimes there is a harmony. What if you only want the first trumpet to play? What would you write? So maybe you haven't seen this before. In this case, you would write 1 period. You're saying that just the first trumpeter plays this passage, 1 period. What if you wanted the second trumpet to play? That would be 2 period. What if you wanted 1 and 3 to play at the same time? You'd say 1 period, 3 period. So this is really a note to the conductor, and it's a way of the composer making a note to him or herself that they want this arrangement. And when it gets to the parts, well, that's another matter. We'll talk about that. Typically, the instrumentalists don't see this. Okay, but what if you want, let's say we're back to 3 trumpets and you want all of them to play at the same time? Well, that would look like this. A2, A2, A3, A4. So if you want all 3 to play at the same time, you'd say A3. Again, this is something that's specific to, it's really a message to the conductor or the composer saying, I want this number of instruments to play the same exact thing on the same line. What about a soloist? So let's say, how about we have the string choir, and they're playing a lush arrangement of something very beautiful, and then you want a solo violin. Out of the whole orchestra, you want a solo violin playing out of the first violins. Let's say, what would you write? And of course, solo. But then you want everyone else to come back in. What do you say? Tutti. The opposite of solo, tutti. Tutti, of course, meaning all. This is a common thing to see. Well, this happens quite frequently in the string choir, that you would have a soloist and then going back to tutti. Okay, so these 3 things, this is probably new information for most of you. I would take a moment to write this down, these 3 different ideas about indicating specific players, 1 period, 2 period, etc., or doubling, A2, A3, A4, or how to go from solo back to tutti. Have you ever thought about it? Why, let's say in, well, you've probably sung some Bach chorales. But why is it you have stems up, stems down, and of course You've been writing in this style for years now at this point. All those classes you had to take in theory class, well, of course, it's to indicate different voices. So you'd have soprano voice here, and you have alto voice here, and of course, different rhythms. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense for SATB writing. Do you find this in orchestral writing? Well, yes, actually, if you have, let's say, a combined part. So let's say this might happen on a big score where you have two clarinets sharing one staff. Well, you might see stems up, stems down. Okay, as simple as that. Rehearsal letters and numbers. Okay, of course, rehearsal letters and numbers provide good starting places. They're also good for long rests. So if they're just sitting there counting measures, well, give them a good place a next place to enter. Now, there are different methods. Some composers use letters, A, B, C, D. Others use rehearsal numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. However, I would highly recommend using measure numbers. It seems like an obvious thing, but think about all of your ensemble work. You've probably performed a lot of pieces with rehearsal number 1 or rehearsal letter A. I find that only using bar numbers will actually simplify things because you're often talking about bar numbers anyway. And where should you put them? Well, put them according to musical phrases. So at the start of the next phrase. So let's say if you have an A section and a B section, well, you might call that measure such and such, and put a big box around it. Here you see measure 50. Now this might be something, it seems obvious. It seems like I'm saying something very obvious, but there are funny conventions actually. There are some scores that put a rehearsal number every 10 measures. It's very odd. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So really those places are where an ensemble can regroup, or a conductor can shout out, okay, so let's take a look at this section starting at measure such and such. Okay, so this is good for you to remember as a practical concern. Okay, transposed versus concert pitch score, so meaning a score in C. So the recommendation in general is to use a transposed score. And why is that? Well, the copyist copies exactly what it sees into the parts, so there's no confusion. Well, that's nice, but do we use copyists much anymore? Well, not so much. Every now and then I am hired to, let's say, take an orchestral piece and maybe there's some missing parts. Well, then I would be copying from a score to parts. That does happen. Imagine if I had to transpose, right? It would be a little bit more difficult. Conductors are familiar with a transposed score. This is really true. They're trained to see a transposed score, and if you give them a score in C, it is rather confusing. However, let's say you have a 12-tone piece of music and you're studying it in theory class, well, that might be a good argument for a score in C. This is a big one. Members of the same family have the same fingering and range, and they transfer that knowledge from one instrument of that family to another. Let's say the clarinets. You have the clarinet in E flat, you have clarinet in B flat, you have bass clarinet. The lowest note of each one of those is the same. The fingering is the same. The notes come out differently. So this is another good argument for keeping with a transposed score. And instructing a performer won't produce confusion. I have seen this where there's confusion between the score, the conductor, and the performer. Imagine if there was a discrepancy between the two, or if, let's say, the conductor is having trouble communicating what the note should be. So it's much easier if, let's say, you say, you could either say concert C, which means sounding, or you could say the letter in that, let's say, a horn in F. Right. So if it was horn in F and you wanted a concert C, well, here's a good conversion for you. A horn in F, if they see middle C, take a moment to think about this. If they see middle C on the staff, the sound comes out as a perfect fifth lower. So they're seeing this note, middle C, but it comes out a fifth lower. If you want to hear a middle C, how must it be written? I'll say it again. If you want to hear a middle C, how must it be written on the page for horn in F? It would have to be written a fifth higher. Okay, if that was confusing for you, don't worry, we'll go over transposition in class. But these are the sort of things that can be confusing for instrumentalists if you're giving them different letter names than what's on the page. Okay, and lastly, exceptions for modern music, as we said, especially for analysis. Okay, in conclusion, are you ready for this? Use a transpose score. Okay, there you have it. Okay, so this was the basic day, and of course, on a regular day, I would be fielding questions, and you would be asking anything that confused you. Feel free to write me anytime, and we could clear some of those confusions up. I'll go over specifics of each instrument group as we go along. And again, this was just a general overview day. So I hope this made sense to you, and feel free, you can always replay this. I would encourage you to keep those notes. If you didn't take notes, well, that's too bad, because it is good for the memory to write things down as you hear them. So feel free to replay it if you want. You can always refer to the slideshow that I have up on Google Classroom as a visual aid. So I hope to see you soon for our second lecture, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.